It's Thursday, March 6th, 2025. The Supreme Court gone rogue, some temporary relief for automakers, and more fallout from Trump's address to the joint session next on the AM Update.
Therefore, be it resolved that Representative Al Green be censured.
And I let myself feel joy about DJ, but I hope he never has to defend the United States Capitol against Donald Trump's supporters.
I'll foster a culture where NIH leadership will actively encourage different perspectives.
These guys have themselves publicly admitted to participating in be soliciting, trafficking, preying upon women.
You have to remember that President Biden gutted the entire immigration enforcement regime of this country.
And I went, oh my God, they framed Nixon.
The Supreme Court has ruled that President Trump must unfreeze $1.9 billion in domestic, foreign USAID payments. Absolutely unbelievable. Four conservative Supreme Court justices penned a blistering dissent Wednesday after the court majority rejected the Trump administration's request to continue a temporary freeze on foreign aid payments. Justice Samuel Alito excoriated the high court majority for allowing a lower court judge to single-handedly determine this timeline for the Trump administration to pay nearly $2 billion in payments for previously completed foreign aid projects, an order he called too extreme. In a scathing 8-page dissent, Alito called the decision, quote, an unfortunate misstep, one he said rewards an act of judicial hubris by a U.S. district judge named Amir Ali. Alito wrote, quote, does a single district court judge who likely lacks jurisdiction have the unchecked power to compel the government of the United States to pay out and probably lose forever $2 billion taxpayer dollars? The answer to that question should be an emphatic no, but a majority of this court apparently thinks otherwise. End quote. Once again, we've been talking about this on and off over the first 6.5 weeks of the new Trump administration. It's time to tell these stupid courts no. In other news, President Trump on Wednesday announced a 1-month exemption on tariffs against Canada and Mexico for cars following a meeting with 3 major U.S. automakers. Trump spoke with the leaders of Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis on the heels of imposing 25% tariffs on all imports from Mexico and Canada earlier this week. Following those discussions, Trump said in a statement read by White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt that the administration is giving a 1-month exemption for automakers associated with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, or USMCA, which Trump signed during his first term. The exemption would apply to Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, as well as other companies with production facilities in the 3 North American countries. While the fallout, good and bad, but pretty much mostly good if you come to a program like this, continues from Trump's just incredible speech before the joint session of Congress the other night. There were a couple of mainstream media polls, one from CNN and then this one from CBS, that showed the overwhelming majority of people who actually watched the speech liked it. 76%, according to CBS. 76% of those who watched the Trump speech the other night approved of what they heard. Here is Congressman Dan Newhouse introducing a resolution to censure Congressman Al Green, who had to be escorted out of the chambers by the Sergeant at Arms.
The resolution is as follows. House Resolution number 189. The President of the United States, speaking at the invitation of the House and Senate, had his remarks interrupted by the representative from Texas, Mr. Green. The representative from Texas had to be removed from the chamber by the Sergeant at Arms. Now, therefore, be it resolved that Representative Al Green be censured.
As Congressman Dan Newhouse introducing a resolution to censure Al Green of Texas. You'll remember DJ Daniel. He's that 13-year-old boy who was made an honorary member of the Secret Service by Donald Trump during his address to the joint session of Congress. Just an incredibly emotional scene and an inspiring moment. One of the most inspiring moments from that evening. I didn't really pay much attention to mainstream media reaction themselves after that speech, but holy cow, when I saw this come through the other day, I thought there's no way that the tweet accompanying this, that the caption accompanying what you're about to hear is anywhere close to the reality of what was said, but apparently my standards for mainstream media are not low enough. Here is Nicole Wallace on MSNBC talking about that moment with DJ Daniel. Listen all the way to the end.
But I think this was a lesson in finding one thing that you let yourself feel. And I let myself feel joy about DJ. And I hope he's alive for another, 95 years, right? And I hope he lives a and the life he wants to live. He wants to be a cop. He knows what he wants to do. And maybe when you have childhood cancer, that crystallizes for you. And I hope he has a long life as a law enforcement officer. But I hope he never has to defend the United States Capitol against Donald Trump's supporters. And if he does, I hope he isn't one of the 6 who loses his life to suicide.
Are you freaking kidding me? DJ Daniel, 13-year-old, beat cancer. An inspiring moment. Here's Nicole Wallace on MSNBC. Oh, I really like that. I hope he lives for another 95 years and doesn't commit suicide because of Trump supporters. Are you freaking kidding me? Whatever your standards were for these apparatchiks in the media, your standards were not low enough. In other news, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, that's Trump's pick to lead the National Institutes of Health, had his confirmation hearing yesterday.
I will establish a culture of respect for free speech in science and scientific dissent at the NIH. Over the last few years, top NIH officials oversaw a culture of cover-up, obfuscation, and a lack of tolerance for ideas that differed from theirs. Dissent is the very essence of science. I'll foster a culture where NIH leadership will actively encourage different perspectives and create an environment where scientists, including early career scientists and scientists that disagree with me, can express disagreement respectfully.
Senator Josh Hawley of the state of Missouri asked and pushed Dr. Bhattacharya on whether aborted fetal tissue would receive NIH funding for research.
To start with the subject that you and I visited about, and that I also asked your soon-to-be boss, Robert Kennedy Jr., about when he was sitting right where you are, and that's the use of aborted fetal tissue in NIH-funded research. I asked now Secretary Kennedy directly if he would reinstate President Trump's policy that prohibits aborted fetal tissue research in NIH-funded grants. He said that he would. Let me just ask you the same to make sure we're all on the same page here. Do you support that policy? Will you prohibit the use of aborted fetal tissue in NIH research, NIH-funded research?
Senator, I'll absolutely follow the lead of Secretary Kennedy and President Trump on this. Just very quickly may say why it's so important that we have alternatives. Because during the pandemic, I would often be on Catholic radio, and people would ask me whether the mRNA vaccines were made or developed with fetal stem cell lines. And I had to say yes. And they had a lot of the folks who were calling in had ethical objections. In public health, we need to make sure the products of the science are ethically acceptable to everybody. And so having alternatives that are not ethically conflicted to fetal stem cell lines is not just an ethical issue, but it's a public health issue.
So why was Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Trump's pick to lead the National Institutes of Health, why was he asked this question? He explained in part, but as William Wolf at the Center for Baptist Leadership also pointed out, Senator Hawley had to ask this question about aborted tissue being used and funded by NIH for research. Senator Hawley had to ask this question because Francis Collins, who is an absolute darling of all of the big EVA players like the Gospel Coalition, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, that was funded because Francis Collins greenlit NIH taxpayer-funded research on aborted fetal tissue, including a project where they sewed aborted baby scalps onto rats. And no, I'm not making that up. You might have forgotten about that story from a few years ago. That is a real story, and that's why Senator Josh Hawley had to press Jay Bhattacharya on that issue. Things are happening in Florida. Attorney General James Othmeyer, fresh off of picking a fight with Target over their DEI policies and how that could have impacted state retirement funds, well, he's going after the Tate brothers, Andrew and Tristan, who had their charges in Romania on, I think, human trafficking and some other sundry issues dropped, and so they immediately fled to the United States. Here's Othmeyer talking to Scripps News.
Yeah, look, these guys have themselves publicly admitted to participating in what very much appears to be soliciting, trafficking, preying upon women around the world. Many of these victims coming forward, some of them minors, people can spin or defend however they want. But in Florida, this type of behavior is viewed as atrocious. We're not going to accept it. They chose to come here and set their feet down in this state, and we're going to pursue every tool we have within our legal authority to hold them accountable.
That is James Othmeyer, Florida Attorney General, just on the job for, I think, a couple of weeks now. I think the Tate brothers, I think they're pretty shady at best, slimy, and maybe even criminals at worst. But if you're a defender, a supporter of the Tate brothers, don't you welcome actions like this? If they really have nothing to fear, they have nothing to fear. If they didn't do anything wrong, they didn't do anything wrong. You should welcome these types of investigations to make people like me look like idiots if they're cleared and their good names are restored. All right, when we come back, DJ Daniel goes to the Oval Office, J.D. Vance goes to the southern border, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz makes a good point. Not really. That's all coming up next.
What a good-looking family, huh?
There's one more thing I got for you, a big hug.
Okay, good. That's very nice. Look at that family you got, huh?
That is DJ Daniel, the newest member of the Secret Service, visiting the Oval Office and presenting Donald Trump with a big hug. You can't make that stuff up. Donald Trump also gave another notice to Hamas. He said in a post on Truth Social yesterday, quote, "Shalom Hamas means hello and goodbye. You can choose. Release all the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. Only sick and twisted people keep bodies, and you are sick and twisted." Once again, Donald Trump, President Trump, putting Hamas on notice. Down at the southern border, J.D. Vance, Vice President, took a question asking about the biggest challenges left over from the Biden administration in securing the southern border and enacting deportation.
So first of all, Rome wasn't built in a day, and we have seen pretty significant increases in deportations and apprehensions and arrests. But we have to remember that President Biden gutted the entire immigration enforcement regime of this country. We are trying to rebuild so that we actually empower people to enforce the immigration laws of the American people. It is common sense. It's what the American people want us to do. There are a couple of other things that we're working on. I don't want to get ahead of any public announcements, but one of the ways that we wanted to make sure that we're enforcing our border is that we make it easier for people who are here illegally to go back home of their own accord. We don't want to have to go around and arrest every person, but we will enforce the American people's immigration laws. If you're here illegally, the message from our administration is you should go back home, and if you want to come to the United States, apply through the proper channels. That's an important thing that we're doing. And the final thing is this costs money. One of the most important parts of the president's reconciliation priorities is, of course, tax reform on the one hand, and on the other hand, making sure that we get proper resources so that we can pay for the flights, and we can pay for the detention centers, and we can pay for all the components necessary to ensure that we're re-migrating illegal immigrants back to their country of origin. I guarantee it is a part of the president's priorities. We'll keep on working on it. We've made a lot of progress, but we're going to keep on working on it over the remainder of the president's term.
Vice President J.D. Vance at the southern border, Eagle Pass, Texas, to be specific. Seeing some of the video of Vance's visit to the border, and seeing some of the videos from Eagle Pass over the last 4 years, it's basically crickets right now. So there is progress being made, but Vance says there's a long ways to go. You know what? Tim Walz, the old vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, Minnesota governor, he actually makes a good point here.
The idea of a president standing at that rostrum and throwing a slur at a United States senator in the middle because you disagree on policy is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, that is Walz talking about President Trump, referring to Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, as Pocahontas the other night. You know what? I think Tim Walz is finally right about something. I think he makes a good point here. That was just uncalled for. Throwing a slur at a sitting United States senator. Sincerely, signed Aaron McIntire, a xenophobic, homophobic, transphobic Nazi. What's up with this? So finally, Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, has a badass moment. And immediately his chief of staff gets arrested for DUI. Hayden Haynes, the chief of staff to House Speaker Mike Johnson, and one of those powerful aides on Capitol Hill, was arrested after President Trump's joint address to Congress for drunken driving after his car struck a Capitol vehicle. That's according to two law enforcement sources talking to NBC News. Johnson's office also confirmed the incident. One of the sources told NBC News that a police report indicated Haynes hit a Capitol vehicle around midnight and was arrested and released with a citation to appear in court. The arrest came after Trump's speech Tuesday night. Good thing, sounds like nobody was hurt. So-called gender-affirming surgery could lead to potentially dangerous mental health effects. That's according to a new study. So-called transgender individuals face a quote-unquote heightened psychological distress, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, partly due to stigma and lack of gender affirmation, as stated in the study, which was published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine. Researchers from the University of Texas set out to determine the mental health impacts from so-called transgender people who underwent so-called gender-affirming surgery. The study focused on 107,583 patients, 18 years old and over, with gender dysphoria, some who underwent surgery and others who did not. So I mentioned this study says partly due to stigma and lack of gender affirmation. How much more affirmation could anyone ask for in the pursuit of this mental illness than to actually go through with meatball surgery? And yet, that's still not enough. It tells you one thing. It tells you one thing. It's all a scam. Just all a complete and total scam. A very nefarious one at that. Irreparable harm to those who get these meatball surgeries, with no positive outcomes whatsoever, and a nice fat pocket for the ones doing these meatball surgeries. That should tell you all you need to know. And now here's this. Bill Murray joined the Joe Rogan Experience recently and says he's having second thoughts about the legacy of one Richard Nixon.
However, when I read Wired, the book written by, Woodward, about Belushi, I read like 5 pages of Wired, and I went, oh my God, they framed Nixon. like all of a sudden I went, oh my God, if this is what he writes about my friend that I've known, for half of my adult life, which is completely inaccurate, talking to like the people of the outer circle getting the story. What the hell could they have done to Nixon?
So that is Bill Murray on the Joe Rogan Experience, discussing Bob Woodward's book on his good friend Jim Belushi, realizing 5 pages in that Jim Belushi, man, that Mr. Murray had known his basically entire career life, adult life, was just utter fiction. Now having second thoughts about whether Bob Woodward's Washington Post reporting on Richard Nixon and Watergate was real. So with that as the backdrop, Bill Murray, current day, having second thoughts about whether or not Richard Nixon was framed for Watergate. With that as the backdrop, let's revisit Richard Nixon's interview with Frank Gannon back in 1983.
Do you count Woodward and Bernstein among the, in which of the two camps of reporters do you count Woodward and Bernstein?
Well, it'd be obviously where I would count them. I think that their reporting, I have not read their book, but from those that were interviewed and then misquoted in their books, I say that it was not that responsible. It was advocacy journalism.
Is there any way to get some kind of a handle on this situation? Should the media be investigated? Should it be controlled?
No, I may disagree, for example, with what some president does with his power, but I don't want to abolish the presidency, or I don't want to control it. The same is true of the press. I believe in a free press. I do not want government control under any circumstances or government censorship of either radio, television, or newspapers. But I'm simply suggesting here that all of the media should look within themselves. Look through that microscope at themselves. Look in the mirror now and then, rather than looking out there to others.
Do you think there was or is a deep throat?
I haven't the slightest idea. I read in newspaper accounts the speculation about this one or that one. They even thought Al Haig was deep throat. That's ridiculous, of course. And if all the charges are as ridiculous as that, I would gather it was probably a composite. In other words, it might have been simply a fictitious character that they had to use in order to give more credibility to what they were trying to report.
In terms of the enormous credibility and fascination that Deep Throat assumed as a result of that reporting, if it is in fact a composite, or if he doesn't exist at all, is that a serious abuse of, or how serious an abuse of journalistic power is that?
It's a terribly serious abuse. It's making something up. It is starting with the point of view and then developing the facts, the fiction, in other words, to make the point of view survive. In other words, it's basically making fact out of fiction.
What do you think? Was Richard Nixon framed? This is one of those things that I'm took for granted my entire childhood, I'm now having second thoughts about. Second, third, and fourth thoughts. I think he was framed. When we come back, it's time for the poll of the week. We hear from you next. And finally, Air Analysis poll of the week. I asked you, do you think we're ever going to get the Epstein docs? And boy, howdy, did y'all have a lot to say. I gave you 4 options, as always. Yes and soon, probably. LOL, no, and other comment below. Here is the order of finished. Other was in last place. We'll get to those in just a little bit. Yes and soon was in third place, a distant third place at 5.7%. Probably was in second place, a distant second place at 20%. And LOL, no, we're never getting the Epstein docs, was in a resounding first place at a nice 69%. Let's go to what you had to say. Will we ever get the Epstein docs? Zach says, no, I think Casey Anthony has a better chance of being hired as a nanny than that happening. Well, when you put it that way. Jeff says there will never be a full list available to the public. Auburn Tiger says some of them, but some powerful people will still be protected. Cam says not what we're hoping for or expecting. That's not what we're going to get. It would be destroyed before being turned over to us. So Cam seems to think we'll get something, but not what anybody wants or is expecting. Kenneth Parker says torches and pitchforks will get the truth at this point only. Dalton Bell says maybe some, but there will be no accountability. Kenneth Parker posts the picture of Ghislaine Maxwell with, I can't remember, I think that's Steve Jobs' widow, who says, friends with this much money don't get exposed. Some Call Me Tim says, it'll be a month that we'll get them. Melissa says, I've got my doubts. If they were serious about releasing the list, there would have already been arrests of the agents withholding the evidence from Pam Bondi. Yeah. You're probably right, Melissa. Comfortable Bribe says, show us the bodies. We'll hear about the Vegas shooter first. Tony Linda says, the client list was probably purged a long time ago. I'm starting to think that's probably where this is headed, Tony. Mark Frenzel says, yes, we will, but it'll contain nothing of consequence. I'm not sure. If we actually get the real list, you have to think after all this has been built up to be, all of the secrecy, the whole Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself in that entire saga, the security cameras weren't working when he was allegedly hanging himself. There's got to be something there, right? Exponentially Charles says, just saw this. Pam Bondi says national security information will be redacted from the Epstein files. As each day goes by without any new information and any release gets more qualified, the more I believe we won't see anything of importance and no one will be held accountable. Charles, I can't really blame you or anyone else at this point in this entire saga for having that level of pessimism. Stephen Holmes says redacted and used for leverage. Erica says too many people involved on both sides. Control Group Randy says we will get something, just not what we think should be released. USA Endgame says it's not that they don't want to release the list, it's that they don't want to release the list. Craig Willoughby has the gif of, what's his face, Neil deGrasse Tyson, just kind of waving his arms around and shrugging. Ryan says, my clarification on a no vote is that we will get something, but nothing of substance or consequence. Tom says, I'm somewhere between choice 1 and choice 2, which would be yes and soon or probably. Tom goes on to say, I'd like to know what is meant by soon. Is soon today or tomorrow, or is it a year from now or longer? We need names released. To quote Ray Davies of the Kinks, I'm so tired of waiting for you. Bobby Dubbs says, too many implicated on all sides. Never going to happen. JKH says, some lame version with redactions, edits, and missing pages. Kurt North says, the true client list has already been destroyed. Robert says, by now, anything incriminating to anyone important has been destroyed. So there's the theme there. If there was anything incriminating, a lot of you say it's already long gone. Pessimism abounds when it comes to the Epstein documents, and I can't blame you in the least. That will do it again for this edition of the AM Update. Back at it again tomorrow with Ask or Tell Me Anything. Make your submissions at the pinned tweet on my X profile at RealAMUpdate. Ask me any question you want. Tell me any news story you think needs covered. That's coming up tomorrow on the Friday edition. Until then, have a wonderful day. I'm Aaron McIntire, and this is the AM Update.